This is another Traffic Pros show presented by EndorsedTrafficPros.com. My name is Andy Hussong, and our guest today is a gentleman who's going to show you a traffic method that's been proven to not only build your brand and sales, but even for getting the most from your JV and affiliate promotions. And as you guys know, I've been doing the JV thing for almost 20 years now, and so I wanted to really introduce you to this guy who's a recent connection of mine who we've become pretty good friends over the last couple months, just brainstorming some ideas together. And his name is Tony Guarnaccia, and he's going to show us some cool software that he uses to make it all happen as well. So Tony, welcome to the call, man.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate being here today.
You got it. Well, just as a little intro of Tony, just so you guys know, Tony's grown over 10,000 small businesses and a dozen Fortune 500 companies, including ADP, Ford, and AutoNation, and became the Google Partner of the Year. Later, Tony returned to his entrepreneurship roots to bring the strategy, tactics, and resources normally reserved for large enterprises to small businesses. Today, he's focused on bringing that same vision to podcast hosts and guests to make podcasting profitable. So now that we've got the official intro out of the way, I want to back this up just for a second, let you guys know that I was recently introduced to Tony by my business partner, Vinny Leone. And when he told me about Tony and what he does for people, helping them set up their podcast system, both on the hosting side and on the guest side, I thought, man, I really want to talk to him because I think there's probably some ways this could help on the joint venture / endorsed traffic side of things, but I found out that it was way better than that. And so what I wanted to ask Tony first, Tony, first of all, it was years ago, it was like 2010, I did a product launch. And at that time, I remember I was interviewing someone who did a podcast. And I thought, man, I definitely want to start my own podcast. And I just never did. I had this idea, but I wasn't sure how to do it. There were a lot of technical challenges at the time and everything. And so fast forward to now, people tend to think, man, there are podcasts all over the place. And I know I, for one, hesitated putting together a podcast for the reasons I mentioned. I thought, man, there are just so many out there. But what do you have to say about anyone who might be thinking about doing a podcast, but maybe they're a little overwhelmed with what it takes to make that happen, as well as if they think, hey, there are so many, how am I going to fit in with my own podcast?
Yeah, well, I think there's always room because it comes down to looking at your niche and being very specific and tailoring your content to that niche. But beyond that, if you look at podcasting, it's growing in popularity of listeners. But on the flip side, unfortunately, there's a huge churn problem. So 85% of podcasts fail within just the first, I think it's 5 or 6 episodes. And they actually have a term for it in the industry called pod fade. So even though there's been millions launched, in reality, there's not that many. If you look actually in the business world, there's probably less than 100,000 active podcasts, which is really quite incredible. So there's plenty of room. And I think at the same time, there is going to be a lot of growth as we move forward. Why? Because more and more people are moving away from just audio-based podcasts into video-based podcasts. The reason why they're doing that is because, as you know, everyone needs video-based content because of the rise of TikTok, the rise of YouTube Shorts. All these outlets are necessitating the creation of content, and that's where more and more people are leveraging podcasts because it's very easy to have a conversation relative to writing, your own custom scripts for a video. And so you're going to see more and more people doing that. And plus, the algorithms of YouTube and TikTok are really starting to favor creators. And so the world has changed dramatically over the past few years. It used to be about how many followers you have. Now it's really about the content and the quality of that content. So it's shifted from getting fans and followers to really your content and becoming discoverable. Because TikTok is taking people that basically have no audience and giving them a great spotlight virtually overnight. And so now is a golden period, I believe, of the rise of podcasting, both audio-based, but more specifically, video-based.
Awesome. So I know, again, like I said, I've been thinking about doing something similar to that. And we've recently started our own kind of quote unquote show, as you guys heard in the intro. But for those who are looking to do something like this and get really serious about it, I know that you have some software that helps people both on the hosting side and on the guest side. We can get into a little demo here very shortly. But I wanted to ask you, how has that helped in terms of you helping your clients to get their podcast going or to actually get guests or to be a guest on other podcasts?
Yeah, so there's two sides of business, as you mentioned. One is to get people booked on podcasts. The other one is to start a podcast. They both have been very effective because the process makes it very simple. So basically, we take what used to cost a lot of money when you're leveraging expensive podcast booking agencies. So there's agencies out there that'll get you booked on podcasts, but unfortunately, it can cost thousands of dollars a month. With our system, it can be done for less than $100 a month, and the process walks you through step by step. So you can literally have everything you need done in probably under an hour. And so that's on the guest side. Same thing with podcasting. If you want to launch a podcast and launch it correctly, a lot of times you're going to want to work with an agency. And so we took all the agency systems I've used both in my digital marketing career as well as kind of in my podcasting career and kind of systemized it into a single system. So now you can launch a professional level podcast in less than 6 weeks, or really less than 6 hours, because it's just 1 hour a week. And then after that, it's basically 1 hour a week, in perpetuity, if I can even say that. And so you're basically looking at 4 hours a month to keep your podcast active.
Okay, sweet. So one problem I've had with podcasting over the years, though, if you want to call it a problem, is that it's always been cool to be on podcasts. And I know when I've been interviewed for podcasts, I give my all, right? And I always have this buzz when I'm done because, hey, that was a lot of fun. I feel like I helped people or whatever, but I never really figured out or really put a lot of effort into how to monetize it. So can podcasting be profitable when you're just starting out, for instance? And if so, like, you have any ideas around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it depends on which side of the chair you're on. Again, they both can be. Let's break it down. So if you're a guest, one of the most effective things I've used it for is to create joint venture relationships. And so one thing if someone has a podcast, that means they have a platform and they probably have some sort of audience. Maybe it's small, maybe it's bigger. And so getting on that podcast is one of the best ways you can monetize your product and services. The mistake that most people make is they stop with the podcast interview. So they make the assumption that people are going to hear it and then take action. But unfortunately, that's usually not the case. And so what I teach people to do is how to leverage the green room conversations. These are the conversations that happen before the podcast and after the podcast. Add as much value as possible, build rapport, and then turn that conversation, that interview, into a joint venture opportunity. So what's the difference? Well, a joint venture opportunity, a lot of times you want to have a great offer that converts. That's without saying. You want to make sure you have a way for to track it. So you want to use like a tracking code, affiliate links. Our software supports that. But the most important thing is you want to take the conversation from just being an interview-based conversation to saying, okay, can we also email this? That's your biggest, most valuable thing. And on the podcast side, I always tell podcasters your number one asset you want to build is your email list. And so I teach podcasters, you really want to build a platform. A platform consists of properties. What's a property? So a property would be a podcast. It could be a blog. It could be a website. It could be an email newsletter. These are basically containers for your content. What goes in those is content. This is where the podcast comes into play. This is where writing an email comes into play, which, by the way, you can use the podcast for that. Comes where your blog post comes into play. You can use the podcast for that as well. So the podcast is kind of the hub of a hub and spoke system. And then the last element you need is the audience. So on the podcaster side, we teach people to build their platform, which is their properties, their content that goes in those properties, and their audience. And on the flip side, on the guest side, who maybe have a joint venture they want to promote, or product or service they want to promote, we teach them to go on those platforms on the podcast and then do a joint venture with a podcaster where they're going to expose them across that whole platform. So in particular, getting on that email list and making sure the content supports it. And that's where really the power comes in, whether you're on the host side or on the guest side. Obviously opposite sides of the table, but the principles kind of hold true equally for both.
Right. So what's really cool about this, it makes me think about how I've told people before that to really focus in on those conversations you have with people on calls before a JV promotion, for instance. I always encourage people to get on I call it a 15-minute brainstorm call, right? To discuss all the possibilities and how to set up the promo. Well, this sounds similar to that, where you're showing people that as a host, you get somebody on board that's a guest to have those deeper conversations before you actually even do the interview or after the interview to discuss, ideas for continuing to work together, how to get the most from that podcast, for instance, and to do those joint venture deals, right? So I think that's love for you to show people kind of behind the scenes of what you're doing on the demo side of things, and then as you're doing that, we'll work into some other questions that I have for you around the joint ventures, and maybe while you're showing the demo, you can give a little example behind the scenes of how people can leverage podcasting to do these joint ventures, both on the hosting and guest side.
Sure, I'll share some screenshots because that's way easier. I learned years ago to do live demos when I did one for a Fortune 500 company, and for some reason the software didn't work. But let me open up the PowerPoint, and I'm happy to share. And so basically, this is on the guest side, and the principles we talk about there is really growing three things. You want to grow your audience, you want to grow your impact, and you want to grow your income, which of course that's where joint ventures come into play. And so from an audience perspective, I'm going to go very quickly through this. If people want to see the full webinar, happy to have them on. But if we look at growing your audience, we know podcast interviews are one of the best ways to do that. And so the first question you want to answer is, how do you find the podcasts that are going to interview you? And so the first thing you want to do is find those target podcasts. And so there's lots of ways to do this. Where I suggest people start, if they've never been on a podcast before, is just to start with your own network. Then tap into different communities online. There's podcast directories. There's agencies that, will get you on high quality podcasts, but you're going to pay money. And then the last kind of way to do it is to search. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. And so the reason why this is important is when you know what to look for, it's actually pretty easy to find the podcasts that want guests just like you. And so what do you look for? One hack, and what I suggest you do, is look at all the industry thought leaders to see where they've been a guest on a podcast. So you can look at events, you can look at social media, you can look at authors, coaches, speakers, what kind of books do they have out? And then there's also directories, speaker directories. So you take that data and then you want to basically search podcasts for it. So the first thing you want to think about is, do you have an existing relationship with that person, or do you know someone that does? Do they have a decent reach? Are they relevant to what you're trying to do? You want to make sure it's relevant. Otherwise, you're not going to have the right audience. You want to make sure they're still active. Like I said, a lot of podcasts, there's been a lot of podcasts, but unfortunately, a lot of them are not alive today. So you want to make sure they're active. And then you want to get a sense of how much impact they have. So how many reviews they have. And so if you search for all this, you're going to get a good idea of the podcast that will interview you. And so there's different search terms you can use, like for in Google. So you can use kind of, if you go back to old school SEO, there's some different hacks for that. So if you look at this, I'm basically using the search term in title podcast, and then you put in someone's name, or it could be a topic. It doesn't have to be it could be any keyword, and you'll get a list of different podcasts that person's been on or about that topic. And so that's kind of the way to do it. And then you want to qualify those podcasts. So do they reach your audience? Do they fit your areas of expertise? Are they consistently producing content? Because some are kind of, they'll take months off at a time. And then really, is the audience engaged and interested in your topic? Because you want to make sure you're resonating. Otherwise, ultimately, people won't convert. And then you want to think about, how do I pitch them? So you want to see if you can get their contact information. Email is preferable. Sometimes they have a submission page where you go on their website and submit it. or they have a contact page. That's kind of the second choice. Social media is a big one. So a lot of times you can use LinkedIn or Facebook to message those individuals or leverage email. And so you want to get warm introductions first of all. That's the best way to do it. Connect with people on social, get their application form, go to the contact page, or sometimes they have a Patreon page as well you can use. Most podcast pitches, however, are made through email. My personal favorite way to do it is through social media. And so the easiest way to find podcasts, though, because let's face it, all of what I just described is a ton of work. Well, that's actually where our software comes in. So we take that whole process and automate it where you can do it in literally minutes. So now you can search for any guest worldwide by country. You can see the total number of interviews they've done. That's good for competitive intelligence. You can get direct links to the podcast where someone's appeared, or it could be a keyword. It doesn't have to be a person. I like searching by people because they've already vetted. Because a lot of times, here's the hack. A lot of times people spend a lot of money with a podcast agency, thousands, maybe $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month to do this research. Now you just put in the name and they've already done the research for you. So it's very simple. So you get the podcast links, then you get the description, then you get the categories of what the podcast is in. You get the total number of episodes, so you make sure they've been at this for a little while and it's not their first podcast, they're just starting. You get the last episode. That's probably the most important thing because you want to make sure they're active and they haven't churned out. You can get access to the actual interview your competitor did, so you can listen to what they said. And the reason why that's important is you can give a contrarian viewpoint. So you listen to the competitor, say, hey, that's great. Here's my take on it. Love to be on your podcast. Then, of course, you get their contact information, probably the most valuable thing. That saves so much time. And now you just hit one button, you export it and put it into your CRM system. So that's basically the system in a nutshell from a search perspective. What we do as well is we help you build. I'm going to fast forward down here just for the sake of time. The other thing what we do is we create a media kit or a podcast one sheet that has all your contact information in one place. And then finally, we help you pitch. So really at the end of the day, we help you with your messaging, find the podcast, and then with your pitch. And so the pitch, what this does essentially, we're going to take that podcast and the data about that podcast specifically that you want to be a guest on. Then we take the information about you from your media kit or your one sheet. What's on the one sheet? Well, this has your bio, your topics, your questions, your offers. And so it's a great way to get in the door with a podcast. And even if they don't want a one sheet, super helpful. We use it here because inevitably someone's going to say, hey, do you have an intro I can use? Do you have a headshot? Well, now I just give it to you and it's super simple for the podcaster to introduce you and market you because they need all those assets. So it starts with your headshot. It's now available to them without even asking for it. And then finally, we take the data from the search tool. It's called the Podcast Prospector. We take the information from your one sheet, and then we take our pitch templates and use AI to automate the creation of your podcast pitch. And by the way, going back to your one sheet, a lot of times people, like I didn't know, I've been in marketing for 25 years, wasn't really sure how to create my topics, my question, or even my bio. Now you put in just 2 or 3 elements about yourself, and we use AI to automate the creation of your questions, your topics, your bio, your intro. So that's all done for you in seconds and just saves you a lot of time, effort, and money. So that's the system in a nutshell. And then we have another system similar to this, but for the opposite side of the chair. So for hosts, what we do with hosts is we help them manage those joint ventures. We help them co-market. So a lot of times after a guest on a podcast, the host will say, hey, can you please promote the show? Unfortunately, most people don't because the process isn't very fluid or easy. So we create a portal where all your marketing assets, as well as your contact information, your social media links, the ability to review you, it's really a very cool system. And it's the only one that's in existence. And it's built to kind of continue that relationship after the podcast so that people will want to continue working with you and maybe do that joint venture. And so that's the portal. And then we have another system that helps you launch the podcast in just 4 steps. We help you plan your podcast. We help you produce each of those categories to make it very simple. So even if you've never done this before and you don't even have an audience, you can have success.
Man, this is fantastic. So I've already seen kind of behind the hood or under the hood, behind the curtain, under the hood, however you want to say it, of part of your system. And what I love about that is what you were saying about how it kind of continues the relationship, but not only between you and, let's say, your host. Not only does it continue the relationship between you and your guest, and vice versa, but I also believe, based on what you're talking about, how the guest can send people back into your platform if you're the host to review the information, also to click on links, check out JV offers or whatever. I think it helps continue that conversation between the end customer or prospect, and or not just prospect, but the listeners of the podcast and that guest, as well as potentially leading that guest to your podcast and other podcasts you may have if you're the host. Is that right? I mean, not not to get it all complicated or anything, but I see different ways that people can stay connected through this.
Yeah, absolutely. On the host side, we have ways to, like I said, market and monetize. So the marketing is really the co-marketing, automation through AI, building all your different marketing assets. From a profitability perspective, there's a variety of models. I actually have a guide on this. I'm happy to share with your audience, but one of them is obviously having interviews with your ideal prospects. That's a very popular method. So if you know someone that might be a good sales opportunity for you yourself, that would be really a direct sale. You can also monetize, obviously, through joint ventures. So promoting someone else's product in this case, as opposed to your own, getting a joint venture. This is taking a joint venture offer. You can do that. You can also get sponsorships. Very powerful system. Right now, I'm working sponsorships with Nike and Celsius using this same exact system I'm sharing here. Or I can't share. I didn't share it in this case, but the same relayed here today.
Okay. So just to kind of dial it back for a minute, I know you shared kind of what's possible on the hosting side and the guest side within your system and everything, but what can you talk about to the fact that this is very systemized for people? So I guess my question is, if someone is looking to begin podcasting and they want to do it right and they want to do it in a systemized fashion and get it out there quickly, kind of, can you share a little bit about what that looks like when they get rolling with you, for instance, to make that happen?
Sure. Yeah, there's just 4 stages. The first stage is called the kickstart. The kickstart phase is where we lay the foundation. So what is the foundation? Well, we start with your avatar, persona, whatever term you want to use for it, but who is your ideal audience? That's the most important thing. Then we look at, okay, what are you going to communicate to them? So at the end of the day, people are listening for something. Usually it's one of 3 things. They want to be educated, they want to be entertained, or they want to be inspired. And so we want to look at those and apply it to your niche. Usually most niches, as you probably know, are, health, making money, relationships. Pretty much they come down to those. And so you can combine all these in different ways to present. Is it going to be a solo show? Is it going to be interview based? Is it going to be on location somewhere? Is it going to be live? So there's all these variables that we've worked out for you. So it's literally you check boxes, figure out what is going to make your show unique, because people want something unique. And so this is where we're kind of building your foundation of what it's going to be, who is it going to serve, and then beyond that, how are you going to communicate that? So really your messaging, what makes you different, how basically your value proposition statement applied to a podcast. So that answers the question. If someone was going to listen to any podcast or do anything else, it's not just podcasts. You're competing against watching the NFL right now. You're competing against YouTube. You're competing against, taking a nap. It's really competing against anything. And so why would someone want to listen to your show as opposed to doing anything else? At the end of the day, that's what we're trying to answer. From there, we're looking at, okay, now that we have that, let's look at your branding. What kind of colors do you want to have? What kind of tone of voice do you want to be? Are you going to be serious? Are you going to be funny? These are all things that make you unique. And then taking that and creating a visual brand. Your visual brand would be your show art and things like that. So that's your foundation. The next stage, which is called Kickstart, the next stage is the amplify stage. Amplify is where we take one thing and create leverage to create 10 or 20. And so I like to think of podcasting as the Swiss Army knife of marketing. You do one thing and you get like 20 things out of it. So now that you have a podcast, you have a video-based podcast that can go to YouTube and go to Vimeo. You have an audio podcast, which goes to, think about the names of where you're getting distributed. You're getting distributed now. You're going to be on Spotify. You're going to be on Amazon. You're going to be on Google. You're going to be on Apple. The biggest names in the world, you're now on those platforms. But it doesn't stop there. We now take that content and repurpose it for text-based content, blogs, emails, etc., social media content. Then you have graphic-based content. This would be your, show art, episode art. So it might be a picture of you and me on a graphic saying we're interviewing. It could be a quote card. So if your guest says something pithy, turn that into a quote. Now you have social media content. So it just takes charge and solves a lot of problems. Beyond that, you now have video-based content. So we talked about being on YouTube, but you also splice it up. So now you have micro content for TikTok and YouTube Shorts. And then, let's see. So we have our images. And then we have images. So you can take stills of this, saying, hey, looking forward to this guest coming in. We had this amazing interview. You can take screenshots. You can just do regular graphics. And so now you have basically the four modalities, right? You have images, you have graphics, you have videos, and you have text-based content from just spending less than an hour a week, 4 hours a month, which, by the way, you can batch these all out at the same time. So the amplify stage is building the foundation for all those elements, things like templates, things like systems. And so now you have your Kickstart, which is your foundation. You have the Amplify, which is really creating leverage for your marketing. And then the next phase is the teaser phase. Teaser phase is just like if you're watching, say you're watching a Super Bowl. Inevitably, they have a movie trailer for some big movie that's not even going to be out till July. Why are they doing that? Because they're kind of getting the audience ready and prepared for when that launch happens. You want to do the same thing with a podcast. You want to just launch it, next week. You want to have a time frame leading up to that. And so in that phase, you might send emails. You might say, hey, I want to get people that are willing to give me ratings or reviews. So it's kind of like a product launch formula applied to a podcast. And then the last phase, that's number 4, is the release phase. This is when you actually go live. And the goal there is really just 3 things: to get listeners to listen, to get subscribers to subscribe, because once they subscribe, they're getting it automatically every single week, just like they would an email subscription. So it's very powerful. So you're always in their head. That alone is very valuable because you're always being in front of your target audience. And the last thing is getting those ratings and reviews. That's it. Those are the 4 stages. That's what our system, our software helps you do. And we also have a training that accompanies it that goes into great detail. So we basically give you the tools to do it and also the education to know the why and the how it's done.
Man, this is awesome. So we'll move on to the guest side of things here in just a second. I just want to tell anyone listening, if you already am overwhelmed by and impressed by what Tony's already mentioned to you and you want to find out how you can get help with this, you can go to the URL I'm about to give you, which is endorsedtrafficpros.com/podcast. So it's very simple. That's just my site, endorsedtrafficpros.com/podcast. And that will take you to a page that allows you to get all the information you need and connect with Tony and see if that's a fit for you. So let's just move on though. So all that side is obviously on the hosting side for anyone looking to start or improve upon a podcast that they already have going on. Maybe they're a little overwhelmed trying to figure out how to get it all put together. And so that's something that obviously you're able to do for them, Tony, through the method that you just laid out for them. So let's say on the other side of things, someone wants to be a guest on these podcasts, and I know you've got some software related to that too, what is it they need to do to, obviously, they'll get in touch with you first, but what is it that you do for them, kind of in the early stages, helping them be seen on or seen and listened to through various podcasts and get booked for these podcasts?
Yeah, so similar to what I demoed a minute ago, we break it down to 3 steps. One, find all the podcasts that will interview you. So we have a search engine or search tool called the Podcast Prospector for doing that. So you put in any keyword. My favorite is to put in competitors or other, people like yourself, or you can put in a specific keyword and use negative keywords. So you could say, hey, I want people to talk about AI, but we don't want them to talk about, machine learning or whatever, which is similar. Um, and so that is the search tool, the prospector. The second stage is really dialing your messaging because you want to ultimately persuade the podcast host to have you on their show. You have to really have a compelling message. So just like we start with the podcast side, we do the same thing on the guest side. Is start with your audience. Who specifically do you want to serve? And then breaking that down a little bit simpler for the guest, but really what topics, questions you want to address that serve the specific needs. At the end of the day, everybody's looking for transformation. I mentioned, they were looking for to be educated, entertained, and inspired. But beyond that, the core actually is really important. It's the transformation. So where are they today and where they want to be? That's the problem you want to solve. And so your podcast interview usually takes the first few stages of that and solves that problem. So if you break this problem down into 10 steps, maybe your interview takes them past steps 1 and 2. Then when they get your offer, like your what people call lead magnet sometimes, that might take them to 3 or 4. And then your product or service that you're selling, you're going to take them from 5 all the way up to 10. And the key thing is to understand there's always an exchange. And so the first exchange is really for someone's time. It goes back to what I said before. Why would they listen to you as opposed to doing anything else? So ultimately, you're adding value to your audience from a business perspective. It could be entertainer telling jokes as well, but I'm going to keep this business centric. Um, with the business, you want to provide value, and the exchange is the value you're giving for the time they're investing to listen to you. The next exchange is more valuable information in exchange typically for their contact information and a deeper level of engagement. And then the last one, which is the one everyone loves, is the exchange of your product or service for money. And so your podcast interview is that first stage of that. And so with all of this foundational stuff, your messaging, we also help you create your value proposition, which is 3 things. The topics you're going to address, the questions you're going to answer, that's how you're adding value. And then the last stage is your offer. So if you're doing a joint venture, that's how you're adding offer to the host because maybe you split that revenue, but it's also the value ultimately you're going to give to the listener because that's the transformation they're going to get by virtue of purchasing your offer. So usually we like to have offers at 2 levels. One, to have them get their contact information, which is that lead magnet, and then one that you would sell. And so now that you have your messaging, the last stage is easy. This is where you pitch. So we basically take the information about that podcast specifically, we take your messaging, and then we customize it at the individual level. So a lot of people will have a generic pitch or a generic one sheet. With software, we can duplicate your one sheets and duplicate your messaging so it's tailored specifically to the audience. And that's what I always do. I have more success when I'm more specific. So in this case, I'm making it very specific content to your audience, which is more compelling. If I just talked about the same boring thing, if you Google my name, you'll see that every podcast interview I do is a little bit different because I'm talking really to that audience. And so it's way easier to get booked on podcasts when you're specific, but more importantly, it's way more compelling for the audience to listen and ultimately more likely for them to take the next step with you if you're specific. And now with AI and software, it's very simple to do. Just wasn't able to do that before.
Right. So I guess what you're saying on the guest side of things, instead of winging it like I've done, like when I've been interviewed for different podcasts and everything, where you're basically answering a bunch of questions and, give, like I've, enjoyed doing, like I said earlier in the show. It sounds like people are actually organized with actual messaging that fits that audience and that leads people to a pitch that's made. If, obviously the person interviewing you allows a direct pitch. So I guess it could be a direct pitch or an indirect pitch, whatever. So is that right? It basically helps people to not just monetize, but also get organized with how they present during podcast interviews or shows. Is that right?
Correct, yeah, because you could go on hundreds of podcasts. I see this all the time. People spend a lot of money with expensive agencies. They go on, one a week, maybe 50 something podcasts, and then they don't have any sales from it. And unfortunately, a lot of times they'll blame the agency. It could be the agencies sometimes more often than not. It's they don't have a good offer and they don't have a good message. And so you might have the cure for cancer, but if you don't communicate it properly, no one's going to take action.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, if you go in without a plan, I mean, you're not, organized in such a way that leads to a sale or some kind of a client or whatever. It's very similar to, you mentioned earlier, product launch formula, doing a product launch without having a plan, where you say, hey, we're going to launch. I'm actually dealing with this with some people now who are launching a product in the near future and they don't really have anything to see yet or any
Right.
kind of real plan behind it. And so have some red flags going off, like, is this even going to be successful? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. So let's also talk about, now you mentioned earlier in the show about co-marketing, and I've seen under the hood again on that side of things how that allows people to have all the content from the show in one place to be able to send people to. What can you share about the whole co-marketing side of things that's so beneficial to both the host and the guest?
Yeah, so I was fortunate to work at in the corporate world at a pretty high level and did, joint ventures and different collaborations with Google and Ford and ADP, all these massive companies. And what I realized is one of the biggest weapons that big companies use is partnerships and collaborations and co-marketing. So if you just look at McDonald's, right? You have the Happy Meal. Typically, it's like promoting the latest movie coming out. So that's a co-marketing collaboration. Unfortunately, most small businesses just don't do that. So even the biggest companies aren't necessarily throwing all their money at ad spend or other channels. They're doing co-marketing. And sadly, most businesses haven't even heard about it, haven't thought about it, and most aren't taking action on it. And so I thought, what better platform to do this with than with podcasting? And so the problem we solve is a lot of times guests will be on a podcast and the host will ask them to share, but they just don't do it because maybe they don't have the tools. A lot of times podcasters don't tell the guests the show's live until like that day. And so there's not good planning on that either. And so we have basically a sequence that gets people aware of when it's going live. And then we have a portal where we share all the marketing assets where they can get the email swipe copy, they can get the social media content, everything done for them in one place. And then they have to hit one button and it can get shared immediately to Facebook or LinkedIn. So it gets rid of all that friction, which makes it much more easy for them to take action. And beyond that, it has an area where you can give a personalized video message, which can help push them over the edge as well. So, hey, thanks, Andy, for having me on. Really appreciate it. Here's the next step. If you could, possibly review me, if you could just share this, I really appreciate it. You can give that kind of personalized message, which really increases the likelihood they'll take action, but also, again, continues that relationship like we talked about before.
Yeah, and so this whole co-marketing idea, joint ventures and so on. Obviously, like I've mentioned, I've been doing this since 2005, so it's been over 19 years that I've been doing this because I did start on January 1st in 2005 as an affiliate manager back in the day. And earlier in the show, you mentioned how this system can actually help manage JVs, and that really caught my attention when you said that. And I've heard you say that before on a previous call that we had had. And so I wondered, just as a general question for you, I know you've touched on the joint venture side of things a little bit throughout the call, and that anyone wants, kind of an answer to this question, they could probably go back and listen to everything we just talked about. But can we like just dial in like a 1 to 2 minute explanation of how this system that you operate can help people manage JVs or actually do the joint ventures uh, in and of itself.
Yeah. So one of the challenges I realized when I was doing a bunch of podcast interviews, I'll just say on the interview side, it works the same on the host side, but I've done hundreds. And what I realize is I quickly forget, hey, what offer did I mention on that show? Did I give them the link? Is it the correct link? Is the redirect, all this stuff. And so I thought, why not create a simple CRM system, like a relationship management, but for managing podcast relationships as opposed to sales? Because CRMs are great, but not really built for kind of collaboration and those kind of relationships. And so I built kind of a CRM, and what that enables you to do is put in one centralized place the offer you're going to use, the also the link to it. Sometimes you have an offer code because it's auditory, right? Podcast, and so you might say, like in our case, we talked about podcasts, right? That's the keyword, and so it's very important to kind of track this all in one place. And next version of our software, we're going to have a JV one sheet. So I had talked about having a podcast one sheet, which is kind of a summary of who you are, the value you're going to bring with your topics and questions, etc. We also have a similar tool coming out for your offer specifically, where someone can quickly see what's your offer, what's the value of it, how much you're charging, what's the commission, all that is in one place. And it's way easier when you do it with software because it's much more trackable. It's better than managing PDFs or spreadsheets like the old way. And so the new way, it makes it much more scalable and much more organized.
Yeah, so you really got my attention on this because I've been either doing the JV thing for all these years or I've taught it on some level. And you mentioned the one sheet. Like I remember it was back in 2010 when I started talking about a JV attraction page. Setting up a specific page that sells the potential partner I'm promoting for you. So I know that's what this one page kind of does as well. So I'm loving this, and maybe there's some way, and I'm just throwing this out there, as part of this podcast. I've mentioned it to you earlier this morning, how we might collaborate on in some way, taking some of the stuff I've done on the JV side of things, along with your software and everything, and I'm sure we'll find some ways to work together on that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to just mention too that it's very possible anyone listening to this, if you are wanting to get help on the guest side, let's say you do want to get booked. Definitely go to that same URL I mentioned earlier at endorsedtrafficpros.com/podcast. That'll give you some information on that side of things as well. And just so you know, Tony and I have talked about doing some sort of a webinar in the very near future as well. So when you go to that page, it's very possible by the time you're listening to this, depending on how long it does take for this to reach you, there may be a registration option on that page to be able to watch a webinar that Tony and I have put together in some fashion. So definitely look for that at that same URL. Again, that's endorsedtrafficpros.com/podcast. And so now, Tony, I know we could wrap this up pretty soon here, but I wondered if I could just ask you, maybe just a few common questions before we jump off here. Is that all right?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So let me ask you this. What's the most critical skill to develop as a podcast guest speaker?
Yeah, so probably the most important thing is your messaging, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to influence people, and you can't influence people if you don't have a succinct message that's compelling. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And as you can tell, with me, I don't like pause too much with the questions because I know the answers because I've thought through. Well, plus I've done this a lot of times, so I can't expect everyone to have it down pat that quickly. But having that down and having a good story to support it is super, super important.
Okay, good. Well, let's go on the other side of that. What's the most important quality that podcast hosts should have when it comes to interviewing guests?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things, but I would say probably the most important would be listening and doing it with a sense of empathy, I think, because you want to kind of relate to what your audience and questions they would have and basically be that intermediary for them.
Okay. Sounds good. So as a host, and let's say you're looking for guests, is there a quality in the guests that you're looking for? I know I already asked about, the type of skill that you should have as a guest speaker on a podcast, but what kind of quality are you looking for from that guest if you are a host?
Yeah, so you want to make sure that they obviously have good topics and questions that are relevant to your audience. Beyond that, you want to make sure that there's really kind of 4 or 5 things that are important. And so at the end of the day, you're looking for the reason why you're starting a podcast and what you're looking for in a guest is their influence. And so what defines their influence? Well, I'm sure you've heard of known, like, trust. That's a very good formula for this. So are they known? What's their social media following? Do they have a website up? Are they known in the industry? Are they in PR? Do they have PR behind them? So are they known? Liked, you can kind of make sure they fit with your values and that they are kind of in alignment with who you are. Trusted, do they have proof on their website of what they've done? Have they gotten results for others? Probably the most important thing is that on their one sheet. And then you want beyond the know, like, trust. Are they adding value? So we talked about 3 ways to add value: your topics, your questions, and your offers. So are they a good fit for your audience? So if maybe they're a great fit, but they only have a very high ticket offer that goes to maybe a phone call, but your audience only buys low ticket offers. If you're trying to monetize your show, it may not be a good fit. And so you want to think about that. So those are kind of the most important ones. Know, like, trust, and value are probably the ones that come to mind first.
Okay, yeah, good deal. So, is there a good number of times, or how many times should you, I guess, pitch a podcast, in your experience?
Yeah, I would probably do 3, maybe 4, depending on the quality of it, and try it in different ways. So you can try email. That doesn't work. Try social media. The best way is through relationships. So if they're in they're going to be excuse me, they're going to be at an event. Well, guess what? Go to the event. If they have a comment, one hack you can do is look at the past guests. So this is another use case for the podcast prospector, the search tool. You can put in their name, look at what podcasts they've been on, and develop a relationship with other guests that have been on that show or that person themselves, and they can give you an intro. So intro is always kind of the back door and the best way to do it, and it's the most highest success rate. I prefer that much more than just the cold pitches, which work as well. I've done plenty of cold pitches. I find LinkedIn is the best place to do that. But if you're doing email, it's a little harder, so you want to try at least a few times because, it goes in spam or it doesn't get delivered for whatever reason.
Okay, so when pitching your podcast to a potential host or whatever, obviously there are a lot of mistakes that could be made. If it's anything like trying to get someone to promote an offer as a JV partner or an affiliate, I see all the time and that's part of the training I've given too, is how to reach out to people and how not to reach out to people
Right.
to get them to consider endorsing your offer. I imagine it's probably the same thing with podcasts, right? Are there any mistakes that you have seen along the way with that?
Yeah, well, the one that we saw for most often is personalizing it. So a lot of times people actually, I'm launching a new podcast myself, and I got a number of pitches already that says, "Hey, I love your podcast," and not a great way to start when you're lying to someone, right? So like actually listening to the show, making sure they're active, making sure they actually do interviews. So that's the other thing. A lot of times there's podcasts that don't do interviews and say, "Hey, I'd love to be a guest on the show." So obviously they didn't listen to it. So taking the time to actually listen to it, get familiar with it, personalize your topics and questions based on who they've had for past guests, based on past topics. So the more you can tailor your message, the more likelihood of success. And also leading with value. The easiest way to, what's that book, Giver's Gain? The easiest way is to give first. So if you have your own podcast, invite them as guests on yours. And then you can do what's called a swap. You're on theirs, they're on yours. And that's a great way to start as well. Or do it from a different way. Maybe you don't have a podcast, but do you have a giveaway? Hey, I want, or maybe just promote their offer. Hey, I noticed you have this JV offer. I'd love to promote it for you. So you're getting on the roadmap for this person. And really, it kind of depends on the tier of the podcast. Obviously, the higher the tier, the more relational you want to be, the more you want to be in the same rooms with these people, maybe it's a mastermind. The lower tiers, you don't need to put as much effort in.
Yeah, so I was kind of chuckling to myself when you were saying that. I'm a big user of Facebook Messenger, and this reminds me of, being annoyed at those people who reach out and say, "Hey, it's awesome to be connected on Facebook. I've been meaning to reach out to you. I love what you're doing in your business. What is it you do again?" And I'm like, if you love what I'm doing, why are you asking what it is I do? And if you love my profile and my content or whatever it is that you're, complimenting me on, why is it you have to ask those questions? So it's a definite turnoff, and that's what that reminds me of. If
Yeah,
you're a podcast host and you aren't interviewing people and someone asks to be interviewed, it's like, are you even after they said they love my podcast, like, have you really even watched it or listened to it? Right?
yeah,
So
exactly.
that's what that reminds me of. Well, you know what? We'll wrap this up. There's tons of questions I could ask you. I think I'll finalize or finish this with one simple question. And that is that obviously with podcasting, it can be a little bit overwhelming with equipment that people think they might need and all the systems that need to be in place or the step-by-step process. What can you say about how you help people simplify all of that so that they can just focus on creating content or either getting on the podcast or creating their own podcast and hosting others for their podcast?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of money. You can start very basic. So when I got started, I just had very basic. I think I might have even used my computer microphone at first. And so you don't have to spend a lot. A lot of times people will tell you that. In my experience, not as important. If you're going on a very high-end podcast, obviously they'll ask for that, and they will have standards. A lot of times, if they're really that dialed in, they'll send you an email ahead of time of kind of what to expect. Here's the kind of equipment you're required to have because we have a certain standard. But for the average podcast starting out, they don't have that, and so you can very easily get on there, and that's really where you want to start anyway, because you want to build that resume up to get on the bigger podcast. So at least on the guest side, you really don't need that much. On the host side, slightly more, but not significantly. And with our system, we actually have a tool checklist, which gives you basically a whole kit of what you'd want. I think it's under a couple $100.
Great. Yeah. So, and as far as the system itself goes, so now they have their equipment and everything like that. I would imagine that by aligning with you, you basically take away all of that. Let's say anxiety. I don't know if that's the proper word, but or the hesitation to creating a podcast because man, I just don't want to have to try to figure it all out. Or I want to be a guest on a lot of episodes, but you know what? I haven't made hardly any money. I haven't tracked anything, so I don't even know if my past interviews have even worked. So why even bother? So um, I guess all I'm asking there is, do you take a lot of that away so they just follow whatever it is you tell them to do and they're in business?
Absolutely. It's kind of it's just step by step process. So you just follow each step in the process, you check the box, and you're well on your way. And then if you do get stuck, we have AI assistants to help you write, whatever you want. So like I said, like I didn't know how to write my topics and questions. I said, okay, people probably have the problem as well. Why not create templates and leverage AI to make that easy for anyone? So they just put a couple prompts in, and a couple keywords, and it'll give them the output they desire.
Awesome. Well, you know what? I think this has been great, Tony. I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up for now, but it's been a joy having you on the Traffic Pro show today. And again, my guest name is Tony Guarnaccia, and he has a system that will allow you, whether you're a host or a guest, to really ramp up, your podcast results in different ways. Get one started, or just get on the show